Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together. Keep it going like he's your son, Judge Wade McCree.
That's fine. I want to go back to the morning of January 9th, 2009, the Obama inaugural. It was a great moment in history. We all remember where we were. Some of you were there. I wasn't. I was sitting up in the kitchen with my 88-year-old mother, and we're watching the morning proceedings. She's all bubbly with anticipation. Can't believe it's actually happening. The NBC Today show opens with a wide shot of the front of the White House and that big circle drive, and they have two huge moving vans parked out there. One is to take all the Bush's belongings out, and the other is to move in the Obamas. Matt Lauer is doing one of those filler interviews while we await the start of the morning's proceedings. He's speaking with the White House chief usher. That's the head brother in charge of the White House residence, right? And the almost 100-person staff. Oh, he's there in formal attire, the morning coat and striped trousers. He looks straight out of the movie Lee Daniels, The Butler. Matt Lauer asks him how you can flip this house from the Bushes in the morning to the Obamas come nightfall. The chief usher replies, he says, Matt, we have packers and unpackers. We have painters, we have carpenters. We have someone to tear up the old carpet. We have someone to put down the new. And Matt says, and you can have this ready for the Obamas with their clothing, their furniture, their belongings. By the time they go to bed tonight, Usher looked at Matt and said, for the Obamas, it'll be ready when they return from lunch. And I damn near died moving two kids into a U of M dorm room half the size of an arraignment courtroom holding cell. And I thought about my mother, and the night before, it was almost like Christmas Eve for her. Okay? This wasn't, the 40 acres or the mule, but this was as close to it as she was going to get. Or as my father used to say about the history of reparations, the real problem with Reconstruction is that it was working, albeit for a minute. Remember, the federal government had to institute the black codes, Jim Crow, and re-legislate half the laws in America after a minute of true democratic rule. Remember, the first laws of legal segregation were all voter suppression. I guess you've enjoyed a privilege too long when equality starts to feel like oppression. You see, my parents took different paths to their first encounter. Whereas my mother's family left an agrarian lifestyle in 1920s Georgia to come north in search of factory jobs, my father was the benefactor of the two real elements of citizenship that were denied most of our people. And that is land ownership and real access to quality education. My grandfather, Wade Sr., was the son of a Civil War veteran. My great-grandfather was a smith in the Union Army, essentially a blacksmith. He fixed wagons, shoot horses. He was a mechanic. When the Civil War ended, he and my great-grandmother settled in Nashville, Tennessee. Believing that education was the way to advance their family, they wanted their kids to go to school. When my great-grandfather passed, my great-grandmother took a job at Fisk University for the sole reason that her children could attend school free as long as she was employed there. And as a teenager, my grandfather was the butler or manservant for the president of Fisk University to help defray the cost of his siblings going to school. Similarly, my father, despite his accomplishments, was a waiter at the Parker House Hotel. I'm a graduate of Professional Bartending School of America and tended bar while I was at college, and my son actually was a golf caddy. We know service jobs teach a lot of life's lessons. Some of these young folks need to learn those lessons now. But it was this opportunity to go to school that helped my grandfather ascend his social ladder. He graduated from Fisk University and got a graduate degree in pharmacy from the University of Iowa. Armed with this degree, my grandfather became one of the first United States black federal narcotics officers in American history. At their golden wedding anniversary in 1964, Grandpa would tell us stories about his early years on the force. Fearful that white people would not respect a black officer, my grandfather and his family, now with 3 little children, were stationed in Hilo, Hawaii, not a state but a U.S. territory, back in the 1920s. My grandfather inspected vessels that came into port, for contraband or trafficking indentured people. But despite being a federal narcotics officer, my father and his 2 sisters had to be enrolled in the local native Hawaiian school with the Hawaiian children, because even the federal employees' school was white only. After several years in Hilo, my grandfather realized that if his kids were to get the quality education he desired, they would have to return to the mainland. So in the 1930s, they settled in Boston, Massachusetts for one reason. At that time, Boston was known to have the finest public education that a person of color could attend. And so with the help of being a federal officer, my grandfather purchased a house in the Roxbury district of Boston, and his kids were able to go to the prestigious Boston Latin School, the only school in America older than Harvard. As a matter of fact, Harvard was built so that the graduates of Boston Latin School would not have to attend school with the common folk. So my father then went to school. He graduated and became, as we'll find out, a judge. Now, my mother, on the other hand, of course, living here in Detroit, had a different lifestyle. Hers was much more simple. But my father graduated from Fisk, went to the U.S. Army, became a decorated captain in World War II, graduated 12th in his class from Harvard Law School, married my mother, and with the help of the GI Bill, which we know was conveniently not given to the overwhelming majority of veterans of color, but they bought our first house in Southwest Detroit for $9,000. And when Daddy sold it in 1959 for $13,000, he boasted he'd made a killing. In 1954, my dad became the first judge of color on the Wayne County Circuit Court. And he used to tell us of the stories where the judges would regale each other with their war stories about their collegiate and law school adventures. They'd have the brown bag lunches. And always the stories would eventually evolve or revolve around each person's academic credentials. And my father would be corrected by his fellow jurists. "Oh, no, Wade. You meant to say Howard, not Harvard." So common was this slight that early in my father's career, a hiring partner at a major Detroit law firm actually called Cambridge to verify my father's resume, believing, 1, it was counterfeit, or 2, it had been pirated from a white student. I, too, experienced a lesser slight in my educational chronology. I am a graduate of the Detroit public school system, proud grad at Cass Tech and the University of Michigan, albeit 45 years ago, but okay. In my freshman year, second semester at the University of Michigan, I was in my freshman second semester calculus class along with 35 other students at 9 o'clock in the morning. And winter term in Ann Arbor, I was the only drop of ink in that glass of milk at 9 o'clock in the morning. All of us take the departmental midterm examination, and the teaching fellow on the next day passes back the exams, and I don't get mine. The TF then announces to the class, of the 17 perfect scores on the midterm, our small section had 2, Mei Ling and Wade. I'm thrilled to pieces. But this student next to me across the aisle leans over and says, "Are you repeating this class?" Okay. So I should have gone east side on him, right? And had my snide remark about me repeating his sister. But I didn't. I said, "I'm a freshman just like you, but I suppose we both were guilty of an ethnic generalization of sorts because neither of us asked Mei Ling, was she repeating the class? But y'all know she corrected the TF 2-3 times a week. But anyway, I don't think this young man knew how insensitive his remark was to me. Early in my father's career on the Wayne County Circuit Court, my twin sister and I were too little to go down and watch Daddy work. But he would tell us stories early in his career of black folks who would come down to the courtroom just to watch him in action. At the end of the docket, Dad would take off his robe, step off the bench, and address the gallery to explain the nuances of the court's call. And he'd get interrupted. They'd go, "Judge, you don't have to explain that to us. We came down to see the face on a white man when a Negro told him what he had to do." A generation later, when I graduated from Stanford Law School, and unlike my high-performing father, I was closer to 12th from the bottom than the top, I returned to Detroit and took a job at the City of Detroit Law Department. Handling those police misconduct cases, slip and falls, bus auto accidents. And I was entertaining an opposing attorney in my office cubicle, and he looked up and he saw my Stanford diploma. And he laughs. He goes, "Wait, that's great. Where did you get a Stanford diploma?" As if it were like a novelty or a gag, that you could, and put it on the wall. And so, very proud, I go, "I graduated from Stanford." And he goes, "Wait, is your father white?" A lesser man without the reserved training of a Stanford lawyer could have lost his job that very afternoon. But being a man with considerable student debt and having just gotten engaged to the prettiest woman to ever return my phone call, I held my tongue. Or as Barack Obama says in his book, I too know the taste of swallowed spit. And I thought of my mother. And she had lived through legal segregation, government-sanctioned redlining, enforceable restrictive covenants in real estate transactions. And she had to sit there in the 60s and watch my older sister get denied admission to a Detroit private school solely because of her race. So this is all I want for our reparations, and it's nothing new, just two things. One, I want the ability, not just the right, to buy any house in America, and I want the absolute right to have consistent and fair funding for public education. That portion of our real estate property taxes that go to, that fund public schools, I want the same statewide. I'm talking about from Ironwood to Custer, from South Haven to Southfield. Why can't public education statewide be absolutely equal per child? I don't know. After all, what do we have now today? The case of a black woman, Kelly Williams Bowler, who was jailed and fined for sneaking her children into a public school district because she couldn't afford even a modest home within that school's geographic boundaries. If it weren't so important, why would these 33 wealthy families get in all this trouble for bribing their kids' way into school as if it were a right of the affluent? I love the arrogance, like they've done nothing wrong. I can buy my way into this. This is what I'm supposed to do. Come on, we've all seen that video clip from 1967 of Dr. Martin Luther King when he's talking about establishing generational wealth, where he talks about how in the late 19th century Homestead Acts, the United States government gave untold millions of acres of farmland to the peasants of Europe, but expressly denied this same right to newly freed blacks. So here's what Wade wants for the other half of my reparations. A flat-out 0% loan for any descendant of an enslaved African to buy any house in America, comma, if you can afford the monthly note. Hold on. No brother from the car wash is going to buy a $300,000 house. Okay, I got that. But he can buy something. And perhaps maybe a couple of school teachers starting out who don't have the downstroke for a $300,000-$400,000 house, maybe they could afford the monthly note with that guaranteed 25% down loan from the government. Now, there are going to be a boatload of conditions, right? It has to be the principal residence. You have to live in it a certain amount of time. You have to remain current. There'll be a boatload of conditions, but if you stay current on your bills, you pay off that loan, the 25% downstroke is forgiven, someone owns a piece of property, and an economic base is established. Okay. After all, remember, Abraham Lincoln proposed reparations for the former owners of our ancestors, as if they had to get paid back. And just in the last 24 months, our current federal administration gave a tax break to the wealthiest 2% of the people in this country. My guess is none of them are sitting out here in the audience tonight. Yeah, I didn't think so. And I thought of my mother. She was watching that show, and she's hanging on to every word that the White House chief usher is saying. And when they conclude the interview, and Matt Lauer surrenders, he said, you got it. He said, I don't know how you can flip this house in a matter of hours to the Obamas. The usher looks at Matt Lauer and says, I've waited 30 years for this day. And when he said that, I look over at my mother, and tears are running down her face. She'd waited 88 years to see something that she thought she'd never see in her lifetime. And here it was. All of us have experienced a lifetime of indignities despite our accomplishments. So what I'm really asking for isn't much, just a little something for those people who have been disadvantaged the longest. I'm Wade McCree, and I've enjoyed a life of real privilege through the sacrifice of others. And it's through those sacrifices, like Kerry Jackson, my invoice has been paid. But for 7 generations of my people, their reparations are overdue. Thank you.